Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
We have entered an age where sexual identity, once thought immutable, is now fluid. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. When obtaining or displaying identification, most contain the option of male or female. We see these designations on a driver's license or some other form of ID from a government agency. But the transgender movement has begun to challenge those once fixed definitions, and this fluidity has hit social norms such as public restrooms and the ability to play sports. Paisley Currah is author of a new book entitled Sex is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, who explores these changes, and we welcome the program.
Thank you very much.
So I want to ask you about something that came across our wires, which is, I guess, in Ohio, House Republicans have passed a law, or in the process of passing a law, and about transgender girls and women and prohibiting them from participating in high school or college athletics. And one of the things that really struck me was there's this verification process they talk about, which apparently checking one's genitals of somebody who's accused or being called transgender. I mean, all of this seems extremely intrusive.
Yes, it really is intrusive. And it's not just, it's terrible, not just an examination of the individual's genitals, but they have to provide a doctor's letter saying their genitals have been examined, and they have examined their internal and external reproductive anatomy, that they have tested their hormone levels of like testosterone and estrogen. And then actually it also asks for an analysis of the person's genetic makeup in terms of their chromosomes. So it's hugely invasive, and it's going to harm trans kids, and it's going to harm a lot of kids, because it's anybody whose gender is disputed. For any reason or other, that will happen to. So it's the worst anti-trans sports bill anyone has ever seen.
One of the things that strikes me particularly about the idea of this intrusiveness is that we are talking about oftentimes children or young adults, if they're in high school or even if they're in college, they're perhaps a bit more mature, but nonetheless, this is going to have an impact on them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, a couple of things. It sends a signal from the legislature that, like, it's open season on trans kids or gender nonconforming kids or anybody whose gender doesn't fit in with the social norms. And so that's bad. And the thing is, it's like it's a solution, a terrible solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. Like, do we really need middle schoolers effectively shut up playing sports if they're trans? Like, do they really need to be governed by these ideas of like sex at birth? It's just Republican legislators looking for a convenient scapegoat, I think.
And what do you make of the great debate now that's taking place over, say, books in the high school libraries that deal not only with LGBTQ issues but transgender as well? I mean, that there seems to be now a fascination with trying to pull these books and this literary awareness, I guess is what one might call it, from the bookshelves.
Yeah, it's really a kind of an assault on knowledge, because so many kids have like long sought out books in the library, like queer kids, trans kids, just to kind of get some sense of who they are and find some kind of community in books that they can't find it in their school. So it's really an assault, but it's also an assault on just the idea of like the public supplying people with information through libraries that is like not that the libraries are like dispensing information and not ideological constructs of who's normal and who's abnormal.
Now, I don't know how old are you, but did you find any solace in these kinds of books, or were they available when you were growing up?
Yeah. I mean, when I was growing up, I'm 58. So when I was growing up, I grew up so far in the country that our library had like 20 books in it. But it was really small town. But yeah, when I was growing up, when I was later in high school and so on, I found a lot of solace in literature and figuring things out by reading books and learning more about myself. I mean, I kind of came out as queer first, and I was really interested in queer stories about lesbian and gay people.
What did that do for you, particularly emotionally, when you were able to connect with these other people in these books?
Well, I think it gives you the sense like you're not alone. You're not alone. Like there are other people in the world like you. I remember talking to an older trans woman one time, and her first experience of trans was some woman on the Maury Povich show, which was a very kind of out there afternoon talk show with very kind of spectacular representations of different kinds of people. And it was probably what we would now call transphobic. But she was so happy to see that she was not the only person, because she grew up in far western Pennsylvania, and she realized, like, oh, I feel like a woman, and there's someone else who was born in a male body who feels like a woman. So it's just really important. And now, of course, with the internet, unfortunately, kids don't go to the library and pick up books as much, so they can find out information. And my library in Brooklyn has offered a free e-library card to any kid in the U.S. who needs to have a look at a book.
So one of the things that I think was sort of interesting, to go back to some sort of a root, I think, of your book, is that this concept of sex classification that you identified as a denial of women's rights. And we know that, at least certainly up until the 20th century, both men and women had these very specific jobs. Women were household managers, which was a full-time job. And men went either into the fields or into some other profession and in the public sector, as it were. But you identify classification that then goes beyond that, that's simply division of labor.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, because a lot of trans people think, and it makes sense, that bad policies that harm us, that don't give us the identity documents we need, are the result of transphobia. And what I kind of show in my book is that a lot of these policies that divide people into men and women are based on making sure that men got more, well, usually, not always, but men got more rights and resources than women. And so as those policies fell away, and as the state got out of the business of telling women and men they had different rights, it became easier for trans people to get our identity documents changed. But now we're in this weird new moment where there's a convergence of anti-feminist and anti-trans policies from the right wing. So they're trying to, maintain the gender binary, saying we're going to decide who's male and who's female, and we're going to decide that, your birth sex is your sex for life. And we're also going to, have an assault on women's rights, most specifically with the soon-to-be Supreme Court decision on abortion.
So in terms of this idea of denying women's rights, I mean, do you see that extending into obviously the 20th century, and do you think that becomes upended as we move to, say, obviously the feminism, the rise, particularly in the 1960s? I mean, do you see that all connected then?
Yeah, I kind of do see it connected. And the thing is, the court has said, rightly, that the state can't treat people differently because of their gender. So, which is great, but the court has also said that pregnancy is not about gender, because they had this famous decision from the 70s where women wanted to get disability benefits when they were pregnant, and the court said, no, pregnancy is about being pregnant, because not all women are pregnant. So the thing is, that's why they can go after the abortion decision, because it technically is a legal doctrine, not about gender. Of course, we all know that most anti-abortion laws are directed at women. Certainly anybody with a uterus can get pregnant, and there's trans people who don't identify as women who can get pregnant. But the attack on abortion is really an attack on women's gains.
So in turning to trans and the awareness of it, it seems as if only within the last 15 or 20 years, that recognition, for one, has certainly picked up speed, certainly with the same-sex marriage rulings and the gays and the lesbians in the military now. It seems as if that's all sort of the next stage of this movement that we've seen in the United States.
Yeah, we are at the next stage. The transgender rights movement has had tons of victories and successes in terms of letting people change their sex classification and, serve in the military and all that. But now the trans movement is, where much of the country is, sort of in this position where it's become a blue state, red state issue. So in the blue states, people that they haven't passed, anti-trans sports laws, and they do make it. They make it very easy for people to change their gender and their sex classification. So a lot of the blue states, you can just write on your driver's license, you can ask for M or F or now even X for non-binary. I was looking at the states around you. Maryland, Pennsylvania, you can easily change your documents without, especially your driver's licenses, without any kind of doctor's letters. But in the red states, we're seeing this attempt to roll back some of those decisions. Because sex, as I talked about in my book, as an M&F, it used to be this kind of boring bureaucratic thing. So most people just had the sex on their birth certificate, and that was fine for them. But for transgender people, it wasn't. So we go to the policymakers or the bureaucrats, and they figure out a policy. And sometimes it was good for us, and sometimes it wasn't, because they said, well, if we let people change their sex, it's going to interfere with the work of our particular agency, for example. But now it's gone from bureaucrats into the partisan political atmosphere where Republicans are trying to almost re-prosecute the gender wars by picking on transgender people. They're saying, we know what gender is, and this is what it is, and you can't change it.
Well, in terms of recognition of the transgender movement, it seems like it begins to really open up with the Obama administration. We're looking at that piece of the puzzle. Tell me then a little bit about how it seemed as if things were opening up, but then obviously you had Donald Trump, and now we have Joe Biden.
Yeah, it's like trans has become at the national level this political football, because under Obama, the Obama administration, it couldn't do a lot legislatively for LGBT people because of Congress, but it made lots of changes that it could at the executive level, administrative level, including making it easier for people to change their documents and Social Security Administration and passports. And the Trump administration comes along, and Trump never got around to changing making the passport and Social Security policies worse that they were trying to. But they did do this one thing in around Title IX, where they tried to kind of rescind this Obama-era rule that said sex discrimination in education includes transgender people. So they, tried to rescind that, and it was getting stuck up in the courts. And then Biden comes along, and he puts things back. And so, we have the red state, blue state differences at the state level, but at the federal government, it's more based on whatever administration is in charge. So it is a real, trans people are getting whiplash going back and forth on that one.
Do you think that's going to be the future, at least for a while, that if, say, for instance, a Republican or Donald Trump, for example, a conservative president gets in, they will try to reverse some of the things that the Biden administration has done, and then we may then get maybe a Democratic administration, which may try to do something, at least administratively? I mean, is that the future for the moment, do you think?
That is the future. And people were surprised that Trump's administration was so good administratively at changing policies, but they were supported by some right-wing groups who really, understood how policy changes worked. But I think what's going to happen now, unfortunately, is that Trump put so many people on the courts. There's a danger that when administration makes a ruling about how a law should be interpreted, ultimately the courts get to decide. And Trump has put in so many right-wing judges that they could make bad rulings for trans people on that score.
So you think that beyond just simply the changes in administration, this could be a long-term project in terms of the courts themselves?
Yes, exactly, because the courts are going conservative. The Supreme Court and lower federal courts are going conservative, very very far right, and very at a pretty fast clip. So it's probably, I don't know, I don't want to say, but it could possibly hurt trans people for sure.
Because one of the things that strikes me is that when we look at public opinion polls, obviously they have oftentimes a much different opinion of transgender and whether there should be rights and so on, as opposed to, say, the kind of courts that you're talking about. I mean, it sounds as if there's going to be this clash in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's this clash we're seeing in so many different policy areas, from gun control legislation to taxing billionaires to trans people, where the public opinion is really out of whack with what Republican legislators are doing. But because of gerrymandering, because of, judges appointed for life, because the Senate gives, states like Nebraska the same number of representatives as senators as states like, New York. So that is there's a kind of what political scientists, which I am, call a democracy deficit that's built in to the structure of politics, where public opinion often doesn't really have a big effect on the legislative outcome.
So a number of, states have done things such as, for instance, Texas will now allow investigating, say, parents who provide hormonal treatment, for transgender children. Oklahoma, there's a bathroom bill that was just recently signed in which identity is defined by the birth certificate assignment. What do you make of those? I mean, those are like in the bottom. You see those as being enforced at the lower levels, which makes perhaps some of the things at the federal level not mean as much.
Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of because we look to the national government, it's like, oh, that's the government, and we also have our state governments. But we like something like 80% of the laws that govern our lives are state laws. Like they actually have a bigger effect on our daily life, and so that is a problem. I mean, one of the things that happened that was had a good outcome so far was in Alabama, which passed the most extreme law so far in the country about providing gender-affirming care to trans youth. And it went to some families challenged the law, and it went to a Republican-appointed judge, a judge actually appointed by Donald Trump. And the judge issued a preliminary injunction saying, this part of the law where you are going to make it impossible for trans youth to get medical care, that I'm saying that's not going to stand. And his reasoning was because parents have a right to seek medical care for their children, and it's not up to the state to interfere in parents' decisions about what's best for their child. So it was a good ruling, and it does happen sometimes when even these conservative judges are presented with expert witnesses and testimony about what's really going on, as opposed to what they might hear on the internet. They often come around to making reasonable decisions for trans people.
So in terms of what we're seeing, particularly around us, I mean, I was struck by the fact that we do have a popular culture now, particularly television shows, and I'm a big consumer particularly. We see gay and lesbian relationships. We've seen some trans folks, particularly I think it was on Big Brother, I think had one at one point. What are we to make of this cultural change that seems to be reflected in the media and the very sources that surround us?
Yeah, I mean, those cultural changes, I think, are representative of those media changes are representative of where the culture is going in terms of youth who are more likely to identify as LGBTQ or non-binary. I think that the mismatch happens with legislative or partisan politics, where Republicans see the transgender issue as like a possible wedge issue to kind of incite like sort of a moral panic. Like the way they talk about gender-affirming care for youth, they make it sound like doctors are handing out puberty blockers and hormones like candy, And so there's just a lot of misrepresentation of what's happening. And so I think there's just, like I said before, there's like this mismatch between like what people want to see and what some legislators are putting in place.
So in terms of education, one of the things that strikes me is that the schools, particularly the public schools, become a vortex for these conflicts that exist within society, whether it's over race or it's over gender or gender identity. How do you sort that out? And particularly for, say, there are many parents that sincerely, beyond the politics of it, but sincerely say, well, I want to be able to control what my child is seeing and being educated about what he's being told or she is being told. What do you say to them in this changing world?
Well, I think I understand the desire. I'm a parent myself, and I understand the desire to kind of, have your children, read and learn about, the information as the way you see the world. But I also think it's, important to also think about the kids in class who, like, my kid goes to a very, progressive public school, and like there's, not tons, but there's a good proportion of kids who have parents who are gay or lesbian, right? Imagine kids in school going and learning in school that there were only heterosexual parents exist. There are no such thing as same-sex couples. Their very existence as like a kid from that kind of partnership is like denied. Or trans kids or gender non-conforming kids who are like, I don't really feel I'm a girl, but I don't really feel like having long hair and being girly and acting like there's something wrong with them because they might not want to conform to gender stereotypes. One of the things that's really uplifting, though, is I have a lot of friends who do, like, in the courts with the trans kids and their families, is, like, these parents who are supporting their kids in getting gender-affirming support and care, they're not, like, Brooklyn latte-drinking, they may be Brooklyn latte-drinking people, but in the states where the challenges are happening, they're just, like, people who had never thought about gender nonconformity or trans issues, who might even be religious and evangelical. But the thing is, they're parents, and they love their kids, and they, after, they come around and they see who their kids are and what kind of support they need. And it's just like, it's very, it really warms my heart to see like that kind of parental love. So I think the problem is the Republicans make these discussions about critical race theory or transgender. They're only talking these very abstract levels as if the state of the republic is in danger. But when you bring it down to the level of actually existing people and the harm these policies cause, people are much more open to making sure that people have the information and support they need.
What kind of harm do you think this does to children when we're having this battle? We have school board elections actually all across the country, and that include part of this is about transgender as well as obviously the issue of race, but that we seem now to be embroiled in this conflict, this political conflict on the one hand, and kids see this. I mean, they can't escape it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's they see the conflict and they see the vitriol that is often kind of incited, from like the internet or places that are like not necessarily in touch with actual people, and they think, oh, I'm not safe here. I'm not safe to come out. It's not safe to be who I am. And they're, LGBTQ youth have documented higher rates of suicide and suicide attempts. So the stakes are really high for young people, and it would be good if the adults who are talking would understand, like, words are powerful and they convey meaning, and if they let people know that they shouldn't exist, there's something wrong with them, that has an effect.
By the way, are you concerned, given the recent shootings we've had, none have yet been connected to trans or to homophobia particularly, but in the fact we have lots of guns and that one day some of that may happen? And I guess we had the, I think it was in Florida, I think we had one of those shootings. I didn't think about it.
That shooting at the gay nightclub where dozens of people were killed. Yeah, of course, I'm concerned about that. And in fact, the shooting in Texas a couple of weeks ago, there was this crazy right-wing stuff that went around the internet because Representative Paul Gosar tweeted that the shooter was a leftist, transsexual, illegal alien, which was, none of that was true. But now that's been on the internet, like in some corners of the internet, it will never go away. So because people see something that's horrifying, like a shooting, and they also are made uncomfortable by transgender people and gender nonconforming people, so they kind of put them together. So yeah, of course I'm worried. I'm worried about any kids in school practicing lockdown. That last week my kid came home and we had lockdown drills, and like I'm glad they have the drills, but we need to not be having this kind of like mental health problems that cause these tragic events.
And well, speaking of the internet, what kind of role do you see that playing in this conflict that is playing out in the country? I mean, on the one hand, as you mentioned a moment ago, that does open up opportunities for transgender and gay and lesbian students and folks to gain access, certainly, to information. At the same time, it also, as you mentioned a moment ago, can spread a lot of disinformation.
Yeah, I think the problem is on the internet where everybody's in their niche, and so the kind of things that wove people together in previous decades, or like it could have been your church or your union or bowling league or your baseball league or your knitting circle. I mean, people still have those, but now they can fine tune and pick a church that exactly represents their views, or pick the bowling league where everybody's queer, everybody's straight or something. So we have less face-to-face contact with people that's arbitrary or accidental, and so we tend to hang out with people who are like us. And the internet and the algorithms totally do that to us. It gives me it knows that I'm a transgender person who researches gender and sexuality, and I'm interested in kind of a left class analysis. So that's what I see. That's what I see when I search, and that's what I find. And so it keeps people in their little bubbles, I think, which is problematic, and we don't get to see the other side and the kind of concerns people might have.
Because I've also seen where one's traffic, I guess, on the internet can also be picked out and displayed in public. You concerned about that? I mean, I've seen that where people dig into other people's personal lives.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's lots of security problems. I mean, I think there was like a gay app where some right wing folks, kind of outed people, closeted priests, for example. It's going to be a real problem in these states that are outlawing abortion because they're going to try to track women and women's pregnancies, and they're going to try to track women's periods and women's miscarriages. Like it's really a danger. And I was reading about that, and security folks were saying, no one can really avoid that because I'm a security expert and I have a burner phone and I can't even avoid making mistakes all the time. So the problem is like all our information is out there, and we need to make sure that if the information is out there, that it doesn't have bad effects on our personal lives.
I mean, have you seen that kind of intrusion?
Well, I haven't. I don't. That's not my area of research. I certainly have seen where right-wing people go to college campuses and like literally name trans people in the audience, and then they have like hundreds of thousands of followers, and they get doxxed. Their personal information gets out there, and they get attacked online, and it's a scary phenomenon for people because people seem to lose all sense of restraint somehow online, and they threaten to do things that one would hope they would never even actually think of doing in real life. But so that certainly happened to people I know.
Yeah, I mean, it could destroy people's reputations, I guess. This is one of the biggest threats, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But there also seems, I think you mentioned this in your book, that you think that there's a cultural revulsion that's been centered around sex and gender. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think right now there's a cultural convulsion around the idea that like sex and gender are not fixed at birth, and I think that kind of anxiety is connected to the women's movement. So the idea that like women can be equal to men, and I think transgender people are picking on transgender people are a way to pick on the larger gains of feminism. They say, look, sex is just natural. I mean, one way I think it was like transgender people transgender people challenge the idea of a natural binary between men and women that's given at birth. But the existence of a difference between men and women in policy and in culture sometimes is used to justify hierarchies, like women are less good salespeople, so they should get paid less, or women, aren't good at this or good at that. We know that like legal discrimination is illegal, but that's not to say that like women still aren't paid less than men because of cultural forces. So I think that transgender people become like a proxy for this larger anxiety about gender and women's equality.
And I must ask you about J.K. Rowling's this idea. I had not run across this term, trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERF. Explain that to me.
Right, I know. So trans exclusionary radicals are they don't like trans people, and they especially focus all their attention on women. So Rowling and others believe that like biology determines your gender for life, and so a lot of the time is spent making sure that like trans women can't go into women's bathrooms and locker rooms. And what they say is that they're worried about sexual assault. But if they're truly worried about sexual assault, the group to be mad at and to be suspicious of is, sorry to say this, but men. Men commit a lot of sexual assault, a lot of rape, and they don't dress as women and go into women's bathrooms to do it. So it's this weird kind of, I understand anxiety and fear about sexual assault, but then attacking trans women as the perpetrators of sexual assault is just like a weird distortion. So it's just very sad and frightening to see people who call themselves feminists. They're getting increasingly in alliance with the right wing and testifying in favor of these anti-trans bills. And it's a small group, but they're very vocal and they're oddly very good at social media and Twitter, and Rowling has millions of followers. So it's not good.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about the television Pose, which I ran across a few years back. What do you make of that, of the show itself, but and the fact that that there was a network who made this about trans folks?
Yeah, I think it's really actually one episode was filmed right around the corner from my house in Brooklyn, in a church around the corner. But yeah, I think it's really great. And what's so important about Pose is that it had trans people as actors, but also involved as writers and producers. And really, that makes such a huge difference. So trans people aren't just objectified as like, oh, look at this weird, freakish, interesting group of people. It actually dealt with the real problems and experiences of trans people, and not just for being trans, but just as existing as people in the world. So that was like a real breakthrough, and I don't think we're going to be going back to the day when we get representations of trans people on TV and movies that trans people haven't been involved in writing and thinking through.
I mean, trans people have been certainly identified as sort of the butts of comic jokes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, we see that with Dave Chappelle and Ricky Gervais. Like, it's sad, I mean, that, punching down is, like, easy. And they can kind of take this, they can take transphobia and turn it into a commodity and monetize it, and then when trans people get mad at them, they say, oh, look, I'm being canceled, and they can monetize that. They're not being canceled. They're just continuing to make a lot of money. But it's, it's like maybe one of the last groups that you can attack and make fun of. And so that's just, I think it also is a sign that they haven't got much going on comedically, and they just pick on trans people, especially trans women.
So finally, how do you see the future? Are you optimistic? Obviously, you mentioned the courts, for example. On the other hand, you've got popular opinion. Where do you see us going?
Well, I think in the future, if we're going to move forward, we have to all be in this together. So, like, we're all affected by the same problems with, like, the filibuster, the way the Senate gets elected, gerrymandering. So we have to kind of come together and figure out, like, how we can bring democracy back to the people so that, we can tax billionaires, so that we can, enact some gun control laws that people are in favor of, and so we can make sure that trans people are targeted in these states. Well, even in the Republican states, the public opinion is not against trans people having access to equality. So I think we have to kind of like think of it as like a broader movement instead of just staying in our little identity silos.
We've been speaking with Paisley Currah. He is an author of a new book entitled Sex is as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks so much, Don. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.